Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Welcome, everyone. As the intro mentioned, I'm Alexis Dry, and I'm joined today and every week by Dr. James Emery White. Now, Jim, you've mentioned in books and blogs on previous episodes that we now live in a post-Christian, or you've put it also, a post-religious world. Younger generations lack spiritual foundations of faith, and the popularity of the inclusive banner of relativism has led more and more people to say no to organized religion. In fact, 10 years ago, you saw the writing on the wall, and you wrote about this in your book, Rise of the Nuns. What I want to talk to you about today is what you're noticing when it comes to atheism and agnosticism now. It's often helpful, usually in these kind of conversations, to begin by defining our terms, especially since religious terms are often hijacked by multiple groups and they can mean different things to different people. So can you just really briefly redefine atheism and then perhaps discuss agnosticism and its relation to the nuns? That's like the term nun, is that synonymous with agnosticism or agnostic, or are we talking about two different groups of people?
Yeah, it's easy to get confused, isn't it?
Yeah.
An atheist, the classical definition, and we'll probably get into whether or not it really fits, but an atheist is someone who does not believe in God. An agnostic doesn't necessarily reject God as much as the possibility of knowing whether God exists. That's what separates an agnostic. So if somebody says, well, I'm agnostic about something, that means I just, I have no opinion. I don't think you can know or ever can, will know. I'm not saying I don't. I'm not saying I do. And then, so rather than saying I don't know if there is a God, they go further. I cannot know if there is a God, and even beyond that, which God. So a nun is not necessarily someone who is in either of those camps. In fact, the majority of them are not in either of those camps. A nun is someone who, when asked about their religious affiliation on, say, a survey, some type of polling, they're given the choice to select the category that best reflects their religious life. They don't choose Baptist or Presbyterian or Catholic or Lutheran or anything else. They go for the box that says, well, I'm nothing. I'm a nun. The largest group of nuns, though, say they believe in God. They believe in God or a universal spirit. So you can be an atheist, and obviously you're a nun, an agnostic, and be a nun. And you can also be a believer in God and be a nun. So no, they're not the same thing.
Okay, well, you've said before that, nuns have been on the rise. So what about atheists and agnostics? It would seem to fit the cultural narrative that they would also be rising in number, particularly here in the U.S. But is that true?
It's interesting. First, there's a couple things worth pointing out here. The number of atheists in the United States is a relatively small number, about 4% of the adult population. The number of agnostics is a very small number, again, about another 4% of the population. Here's what's interesting. While the number is small, it's growing more rapidly right now than at any time, certainly in my lifetime. The latest research from the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, has found that 26% of Americans identify as religiously unaffiliated, the nuns, making them the largest single religious group in the United States. That's not news. As you mentioned, my book, The Rise of the Nuns, that explored this, came out way back in 2014. It doesn't seem like it's been 10 years since I wrote that book, but it's been 10 years. What has changed is the number of atheists within that percentage. It has doubled since 2013, as has the number of agnostics. Right now, about 17% of all the nuns are atheists. Right at about 20% are agnostics, leaving around 63% who say they're just nothing in particular. So, yeah, they're on the rise.
Yeah. Well, atheism, if I have this right, it's not usually only a rejection of belief in God, but also a rejection of the role that religion plays in society. So, again, with a decline of Christian values and an increased rejection of the Christian faith or the church, I imagine atheists are probably quite pleased with the current situation in the US. Is that right?
No,
Oh,
no, surprisingly, no. In an interview with LBC in London, the famed atheist Christopher Dawkins offered a couple of startling, Richard Dawkins, I'm sorry, offered a couple of startling admissions. First, that he mourned the loss of what reflects the Christian faith in the world. And second, that he would consider himself a cultural Christian. I actually brought some of that interview with me, knowing that we'd be talking about this subject. And this is what he said. He said, I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. He's talking about the UK. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there is a distinction between being a believing Christian and a cultural Christian. I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. And I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. And then he goes on to add that if he had to choose between Christianity and Islam, he would choose Christianity every single time. He said, it seems to me to be a fundamentally decent religion in a way that I think Islam is not, which is very surprising if you've read any of his stuff. This is a man who called God a moral monster. After this came another lament that I ran across that was written by a self-described agnostic, a man named Derek Thompson for The Atlantic. And this is what he wrote. He said, as an agnostic, I've spent most of my life thinking about the decline of faith in America in mostly positive terms. Organized religion seemed to me beset by scandal and entangled in noxious politics. So I thought, what is there really to mourn? Only in the past few years have I come around to a different view. Maybe religion, for all of its faults, works a bit like a retaining wall to hold back the destabilizing pressure of American hyper-individualism, which threatens to swell and spill over in its absence. Then he adds that he feels like the rituals of religion bring that which is embodied, synchronous, deep, collective. His final words I thought were interesting. He said, it took decades for Americans to lose religion. It might take decades to understand the entirety of what we have lost. So I just was struck that a famed atheist bemoans the loss of what Christianity was thought to, well, of what Christianity has brought to culture, and an agnostic of the loss of what Christianity brought to the dynamics of interpersonal human community. Mm-hmm. They both reject the faith itself, but they mourn the loss of its influence. And I wrote about this recently, and I remember when I was reflecting on these two stories, an old story came to mind that used to be told very frequently by a man named Peter Marshall, who was married to a woman named Catherine Marshall. And to some readers who are ancient in age, like listeners, ancient in age like me, will be familiar with those names. But it was called The Keeper of the Springs. And the story goes that the Keeper of the Springs was this quiet guy who kept to himself, who lived high in an Austrian village in the deep forest of the Alps. His job, he'd been hired by the town to clear away debris and leaves and sticks and things that clear that away from the pools of water that fed the spring that flowed through their town. He did his job. He did it well. He did it faithfully. He patrolled the hills. He removed the branches. He removed the leaves. And the clear water made the village a very popular attraction. Graceful swans came and would glide across the spring, and it would create these rich farmlands and these picturesque views and brought in tourists. I mean, really it was quite, Well, the time went on, and the town council faced a budgetary crisis. And they were looking through it, and they saw this line item for something called Keeper of the Spring. And they thought, what the heck is that? We don't need a Keeper of the Springs. And so they fired him. At first, nothing changed. The water flowed as free and clear as ever. The town council felt good about their decision. Then autumn came, and the leaves began to fall, and wind blew, and branches fell into the pools, and soon the flow of water began to lessen, and then a yellowish-brown tint appeared in the spring, and then the water grew even darker, and before long a film covered the water along the edge of the bank, and a stank odor filled the air, and mill wheels ground to a halt, and the tourists left with the swans, and soon disease and sickness began to permeate the village. The town council called another meeting. Realizing their mistake, they brought back the old keeper of the springs. Within a matter of weeks, the waters returned to their pristine state. Marshall's point then, and it's even more pressing, obviously, today, is what the spring meant to the village, what the keeper of the spring meant to the village, the Christian faith means to the world. Mm. And Christians know this, obviously, from the teaching of Jesus. We know that we're salt and we're light, and we know what those metaphors mean and the influence that we have on culture. And I just found it very interesting that now atheists and agnostics are seeing it too through the loss of cathedrals and community.
I wonder what you make of that. Hearing you mention the Dawkins interview reminded me, I did read recently a piece written by Christianity Today's editor, Russell Moore. And he was commenting on what he had read from that interview as well with Dawkins. And his piece seemed to present Dawkins' words as very disheartening, as I think he called it a hollowed out form of Christianity that he was putting forward. And yet when I heard some of those comments, I was maybe thinking about it a different way, that maybe this sentimentality might be fodder for a new evangelistic strategy, perhaps. I don't know. What's your take on it?
Well, I was totally with you, and not taking anything away from Moore, because I think he's right in the point he was trying to make. I just think there are other points that you could make from that same interview. But I mean, his point was basically a cultural Christianity is no Christianity at all. And if the world goes the way of Dawkins, they might try to have their cake and eat it too. And that doesn't leave much. And that's obviously a fair point. But I think when I read it, I thought, it reminds me of an old story of a young boy. I'm just thinking of this now, of a young boy who killed his father. And I think Frederick Buechner tells this story, but of a young boy who killed his father and in a fit of anger, and he was locked up and he said, "I hate my father. I hate my father. That's why I did it. I hate him." And a guard was going down the hall one night in the correctional facility and heard the boy sobbing in the middle of the night. And he stopped to listen to what the boy was crying, sobbing. And he was sobbing over and over, "I miss my father. I miss my father. I miss my father." And Buechner said it's kind of a parable of our day. We've killed God, and now we miss him. And we didn't realize in our anger what we were doing. And so I do think that there could be something there going on with culture and with certain people. I think it is a promising evangelistic starter, that there's at least an appreciation for what Christianity has brought to the history of the West, and that could be a good bridge. And so I was actually stunned at the admissions, encouraged by it, that there is this sense of, I may have killed it off in my life, but it left a hole. I think that's something we could talk about.
Yeah, I think that is interesting, because on one hand, you can miss something, and yet I also wonder if perhaps our society just tries to replace it. Like, as Christians, obviously, we hold to the view that every human being has an eternal soul, and that we were created to be in relationship with God. And we believe that's true whether you personally decide to accept that or not. And in previous conversations that we've had, remember you mentioned, people having cited having some sort of spiritual experience about even the recent eclipse. And you noted how it's a reflection of how spiritually starved we are. So my question would be, if they're not, if they're not missing God, what are atheists and agnostics turning to instead of God? Like, what are they tempting to replace him with in terms of that spiritual void?
Well, I don't think they're trying to replace him consciously with anything.
Right. Yeah, good point.
There was an interesting article that was released earlier this year that I recall looking at, and it was a compilation of various surveys and research that Pew had done in recent months and recent years too. They didn't go back very far because they were just presenting it as kind of a fresh compilation on atheists and atheism. That really was interesting, and let me give you some of that because it answers your question. Obviously, almost all atheists say religion is not too important or not important at all in their lives, and an identical number share that they don't pray, for example, or do anything like that. But almost 80% of all atheists say they do feel a deep sense of wonder about the universe, and they feel that emotion several times a year. A fairly good number have a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being, they say. They find meaning in their lives in ways that are similar to people who are not atheists. For example, like a majority of Americans, most atheists mention family as a source of meaning for them. They really get into their hobbies. They lean into their hobbies. I thought it was really interesting. Atheists are far more likely than Christians to describe their hobbies as part of the meaning of their life. So that would be something that they're filling the void with or attempting to. They also are a lot more into money and finances and creative pursuits and travel and leisure activities. They fill their lives with those things. And while the vast majority of atheists, and I alluded to this earlier, while the vast majority of atheists do not believe in God or a higher power, 1 out of 4 do. 1 out of 4, while not believing in God, believe in a higher power. It's just not anything like the God of the Bible. So that shows that there's not all self-described atheists fit the literal definition of an atheist, which is a person who doesn't believe in God or the existence of God or any gods. Almost a quarter of them, say, well, yeah, I think there's a higher power.
That's fascinating. I never knew that. Well, so where does the church fit into this? I know some churches have the mindset of, if someone is not interested in God, you just kind of dust off your feet and you move on to someone who is. And then others actively pursue those who don't even have God on their radar. You're obviously a pastor of a church. So where do atheists and agnostics fit into your church's mission?
Oh, you're just throwing me red meat.
I know.
You know it. But I'll take it because let me go on a bit of a rip. Our mission as a church is to reach the unchurched. That includes the nuns, and that includes among the nuns, atheists and agnostics. So as you put it, we are actively pursuing people who do not have God on their radar, and for a simple reason. Lost people matter to God, and therefore they better matter to us. It's one of the most important values that we hold. It drives us. And if you want to know why it's an important value for us and drives us, it's because it was an important value to Jesus and it drove him. I'm not gonna talk about this without getting into Luke 15. Just take that one moment of his life and how passionate that he was about it. When you read Luke's biography, Luke 15 is a fascinating little section there, and talks about how the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were standing off to the side, muttering and about Jesus being, he welcomes sinners and even eats with him. I mean, look at him. Now, if you think about that scene for a minute, it really is riveting. Jesus with all of these people of ill repute, tax collectors and infamous for swindling people and extortion, sinners, people with foul mouths and made mistakes and cheated people out of money and slept in all the wrong beds, and the list goes on. People who hadn't darkened the doorstep of a church in their lifetime and lived lives that went against everything the religious leaders of the day stood for. That's who was gathering around Jesus, listening to him, taking in everything he had to say. And when they throw in that line that they were eating together, that's quite telling as well, because the culture of that day, if you ate with someone, it's called table fellowship. If you had table fellowship with someone, it literally was saying, this person is my friend. This is someone I care about. This is someone I'm bringing into the intimacy of my life. This is someone I affirm as having, worth and value, and which is why the religious leaders of the day would not eat with someone purposefully that didn't meet their moral standards, and why they made this remark about Jesus that he even eats with them. It was meant to be very cutting. So what Jesus was doing was scandalous. Reaching out to these people intentionally was scandalous, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. But the people he ate with, and he was doing this with, are absolutely captivated by this man who, while compromising nothing, welcomed them and spent time with them and talked with them about a God who loved them and who cared about them and wanted to be in a relationship with them, a God who just wanted to assault their lives with forgiveness and grace and a new beginning. And while that whole interplay was happening, the religious leaders gathered off to the side and just really were saying, I mean, can you believe this guy? What is he thinking? They're the enemy. Doesn't he know that they're the enemy? We've separated ourselves from them, that it's us versus them, black hats versus white hats, good guys versus bad guys, and he even acts like he likes them. You think his whole mission was about them. And of course, that was the closest they ever got to the truth. And I've always found it interesting that Luke, in recording this, said Jesus heard them. Mm-hmm. Like 100 yards away, and the Bible says that he turned and went to them, and he was so upset that they didn't get the heart of the Father in this, and that they didn't see the truth and the spiritual reality of these people's lives. That he told them not one, not two, but 3 straight stories to try to set them straight. And if you're a Bible trivia nut, it's the only time in all of Scripture where Jesus was so exercised about something that he told 3 straight stories, all with the same point. That repetition was a visceral reaction. And of course, the 3 stories he told are the lost sheep, lost coin, and the wayward son, and that people would be very, very familiar with. And so I really do think that the whole point of this, it was so radical what he was doing. I mean, particularly just think about the story of the prodigal son. That was when he told that story, revealing the Father's heart toward the Son, which obviously was Jesus saying, "This is the Father's heart toward the lost." People's mouth would have dropped open. We just don't understand how culturally, what a bombshell that was. In the ancient Near Eastern culture of that day, no father would have done what that father did. When Jesus has him pick up his skirt, if you will, and just run toward the son to embrace him, people were being like, no man does that. No father who was treated by his son, nobody does that. They would have had their mouths just drop open at hearing that. It would have been too demeaning to the father. The role of the son was to come and grovel. Maybe the father would show leniency, but more than likely he'd be punished, or worse. There were other stories similar to that. This is one of the things that's interesting. That when you look at the parables Jesus told compared to similar parables of the day. And that was another thing that made people's mouths drop open, because they might have been familiar and thought, "Oh, I know where this story's going." And then it didn't go there, because Jesus went against the grain. So, for example, there's a similar story in an ancient Asian legend that tells of another man who had a wayward son. The boy became involved with the wrong crowd, who persuaded him to join them in a robbery of his own father. And after the robbery was over, his friends fled with the stolen treasure, left the son there to face the guilt of the crime alone. So, deserted by his friends and realizing he had betrayed his father, he went home and begged for forgiveness. Graciously, it was granted. The father called all the members of the family together to celebrate the reconciliation and return of the son. And when all had enjoyed, the banquet to the fullest, the father stood and lifted a cup of rice wine up for a toast to his son. And the son took his cup and they drank together on either end of the table. this toast. And as the son drank the contents of the cup, he suddenly grabbed his throat and fell lifeless across the table. The father had poisoned the cup. It was all to make a very public showing of how he felt toward his son. He murdered him. Mm. But in Jesus' story, the people are saying, "Well, I know where this one's going." Though they didn't. The father picks up the robe, runs to his son, embraces him, kisses him, puts new clothes on his back, shoes on his feet, rings on his finger, throws the most extravagant party imaginable in favor of his wayward son. And that poignant line, "For the son of mine was dead, and now he's alive. He was lost, and now he's found." I mean, like, just the heart of the father was just beating, And, Jesus in those stories made it very clear. Something of great value was lost. It warranted every possible effort to find the coin, the sheep, the son, and then a massive party, when even one repented. Mm. So, lost people matter to God, to him. That was a value. And it just coursed through every message, every teaching, every conversation that Jesus had. We forget. I think sometimes we forget. I hate it, but sometimes we forget. This is, the person who said, "Who needs a doctor, the healthy or the sick?" You're wanting me to focus on the healthy all the time. It's the sick. I'm here inviting outsiders, not insiders. And your Father in heaven doesn't want to lose even one. I came to seek and to save the lost. And then if you have any doubt about it, and, just what was he doing with his last moments on earth before his death? As he hung from the cross, blood draining, life draining out of him, he was trying to win one more. And he did. I mean, that's, so I think that if someone says, "Are you trying to reach atheists or agnostics?" Oh my gosh, am I trying to reach atheists and agnostics? I'm trying to reach anybody and everybody who is far from God, not in a saving relationship with Christ. And I would like to think atheists and agnostics and nuns, everybody's top of the list. And so, we do everything we can to reach them, die to ourselves in every conceivable way to reach people. We're going to remove every barrier between them and the message, except the scandal of the cross. We're going to do everything that we can. So yes, I can safely assure you that atheists and agnostics are part of our mission, and for the sake of Christ, should be part of every church's mission.
Mm. Well, that's a wonderful way to end this conversation then, Jim. Thank you. And thank you guys for listening. We'll be back again next week with another great topic.